The Black Plague. How bad it was and how people survived. The Black Plague was a pandemic that occurred in the 14th century. A pandemic is a disease outbreak that spreads across large regions or globally. The word pandemic comes from Greek words meaning all people. The Black Plague affected many people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. It killed millions of people. The exact number is uncertain, but estimates suggest perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population died. 1/3 to 1/2 is a large proportion. If we consider 1/3, that means out of every 3 people, 1 person died. If we consider 1/2, that means out of every 2 people, 1 person died. These proportions represent enormous mortality. Millions of individual deaths, each representing a person who lived, breathed, had relationships, and experienced life. All of those lives were ended by disease. The Black Plague is also called the Black Death. Death is the cessation of biological functions that sustain a living organism. When a person dies, their heart stops beating, their brain stops functioning, and their body begins to decompose. Death is the end of life. The Black Death caused death for millions of people. The disease was called black because victims often developed black spots on their skin. These spots were caused by bleeding under the skin. The bleeding was a symptom of the disease. Symptoms are physical or mental features that indicate a condition or disease. The black spots were visible indicators that someone had the plague. The plague was caused by bacteria. Bacteria are single-celled microorganisms. They are very small. You cannot see individual bacteria with your naked eye. You need a microscope to see bacteria. A microscope is an instrument that magnifies small objects, making them visible. Microscopes were not invented until after the Black Plague, so people during the plague did not know that bacteria caused the disease. The specific bacterium that causes plague is called Yersinia pestis. This name was given much later, after bacteria were discovered and the cause of plague was identified. Yersinia pestis is named after Alexander Yersin, a scientist who identified it in 1894. That was more than 500 years after the Black Plague of the 14th century. Bacteria are living organisms. They reproduce by dividing. One bacterium divides into 2 bacteria. Those 2 divide into 4. 4 divide into 8. 8 divide into 16. This exponential growth can produce enormous numbers of bacteria quickly. When bacteria infect a person, they multiply inside the person's body. Yersinia pestis bacteria normally live in rodents. Rodents are mammals of the order Rodentia. This order includes rats, mice, squirrels, and many other species. Rodents are characterized by a single pair of continuously growing incisors in each jaw. The bacteria live in rodent populations and are transmitted between rodents by fleas. Fleas are small, wingless insects that feed on the blood of mammals and birds. They are parasites. A parasite is an organism that lives on or in another organism called the host, and benefits at the host's expense. Fleas bite their hosts and drink their blood. When a flea bites a rodent infected with Yersinia pestis, the flea ingests the bacteria along with the blood. The bacteria multiply in the flea's digestive system. They can block the flea's stomach. When the flea tries to feed again, it regurgitates bacteria into the new host's bloodstream. This transmits the infection from one host to another. Fleas can jump from one host to another, spreading the disease. The Black Plague spread through Europe when infected rats travelled along trade routes. trade routes are paths along which goods are transported for commerce. Medieval Europe had extensive trade networks connecting different regions. Ships would sail between ports carrying goods. Rats would hide in the cargo holds of these ships. Rats are rodents of the genus Rattus. The most common species involved in plague transmission are the black rat, Rattus rattus, and the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus. These rats are commensal with humans, meaning they live in close association with human habitations. They eat human food scraps and live in human buildings. When ships carrying infected rats arrived at ports, the rats would leave the ships and enter cities. The fleas on the rats would bite humans. When a flea-carrying Yersinia pestis bit a human, it would transmit the bacteria into the human's bloodstream. The human would become infected with plague. The plague has three main forms: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic. These are different manifestations of infection with the same bacterium. The form depends on how and where the bacteria spread in the body. Each form has different symptoms and different mortality rates. Bubonic plague is the most common form. Bubonic comes from the word bubo, which means swollen lymph node. Lymph nodes are small organs that are part of the immune system. They filter lymph fluid and trap bacteria and other foreign particles. When bacteria enter the body through a flea bite, they travel to nearby lymph nodes. The bacteria multiply in the lymph nodes, causing them to swell. The swollen lymph nodes are called buboes. They appear as large, painful lumps, typically in the groin, armpit, or neck. These lumps can be as large as a chicken egg or even an apple. They are extremely painful. The buboes are filled with bacteria, dead cells, and pus. Pus is a thick fluid that forms at sites of inflammation. It consists of dead white blood cells, bacteria, and tissue debris. The body's immune system sends white blood cells to fight the infection. Many of these cells die in the battle against the bacteria, forming pus. Bubonic plague also causes fever. Fever is an elevation of body temperature above normal. Normal human body temperature is approximately 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Fever is caused by the immune system's response to infection. The body raises its temperature to help fight invading microorganisms. Other symptoms of bubonic plague include chills, headache, weakness, and fatigue. Chills are feelings of coldness accompanied by shivering. Headache is pain in the head. Weakness is lack of physical strength. Fatigue is extreme tiredness. All of these symptoms result from the body's struggle against the infection. Bubonic plague can kill. The mortality rate for untreated bubonic plague is approximately 50 to 60%. This means that out of every 10 people who get bubonic plague and receive no treatment, 5 or 6 will die. The others will survive. However, survival was often difficult and painful. Septicemic plague occurs when the bacteria enter the bloodstream and multiply there. Septicemic comes from words meaning blood poisoning. The bloodstream is the system of blood vessels through which blood circulates in the body. When bacteria multiply in the blood, they produce toxins and cause systemic infection. Symptoms of septicemic plague include fever, chills, weakness, abdominal pain, and shock. Shock is a life-threatening condition where blood flow to organs is inadequate. It can cause organ failure and death. Septicemic plague also causes bleeding into the skin and other organs. This bleeding creates dark spots or patches, which is why the disease was called the Black Death. The dark discoloration is caused by bleeding under the skin. Small blood vessels rupture, releasing blood into surrounding tissues. This blood appears as purple or black areas on the skin. The discoloration can occur on the fingers, toes, nose, or other extremities. In severe cases, tissue can dye and turn black, a condition called gangrene. Gangrene is the death of body tissue due to lack of blood supply or bacterial infection. When tissue dies, it turns black and must be removed, or it can spread and cause death. People with septicemic plague could have fingers or toes turn black and die. This was extremely painful and disfiguring. Septicemic plague has a very high mortality rate. Without treatment, nearly 100% of people with septicemic plague die. With modern antibiotic treatment, the mortality rate is still significant but much lower. However, in the 14th century there were no antibiotics. Everyone who developed septicemic plague died. Pneumonic plague occurs when the bacteria infect the lungs. Pneumonic comes from the word pneumonia, which means lung inflammation. The lungs are organs used for breathing. They take in oxygen from the air and release carbon dioxide. When bacteria infect the lungs, they cause severe respiratory illness. Pneumonic plague can develop in two ways. Primary pneumonic plague occurs when a person inhales bacteria directly into their lungs. This can happen when an infected person coughs and releases bacteria in tiny droplets. Another person breathing in those droplets becomes infected. This is person-to-person transmission. Secondary pneumonic plague occurs when bubonic or septicemic plague spreads to the lungs. The bacteria travel through the bloodstream and reach the lungs, where they multiply. Whether primary or secondary, pneumonic plague is extremely dangerous. Symptoms of pneumonic plague include fever, headache, weakness, and severe cough. The cough produces bloody sputum. Sputum is mucus coughed up from the respiratory tract. When it is bloody, it appears red or pink. This indicates bleeding in the lungs. Pneumonic plague progresses very rapidly. Without treatment, people can die within 24 to 72 hours of symptom onset. The mortality rate for untreated pneumonic plague is approximately 95 to 100%. Almost everyone who gets pneumonic plague and receives no treatment dies within a few days. The rapid progression and high mortality of pneumonic plague made it particularly terrifying. A person could seem healthy one day and be dead 2 days later. Families would watch their loved ones decline rapidly and be powerless to help. This psychological trauma was part of the horror of the Black Plague. Now let us examine the Black Plague outbreak of the 14th century in exhaustive detail. The pandemic began in Asia, likely in or near China in the 1330s. It spread westward along trade routes. The Silk Road was a major trade route connecting Asia and Europe. Merchants, soldiers, and travellers carried goods, and unfortunately also carried infected fleas and rats. The disease reached the Black Sea region by the 1340s. The Black Sea is a body of water between southeastern Europe and Asia. It connects to the Mediterranean Sea through the Bosporus Strait. Port cities around the Black Sea were major trade hubs. When the plague reached these ports, it could spread to many destinations. One famous story involves the city of Kaffa, a trading port in Crimea. In 1347, Mongol forces were besieging Kaffa. During the siege, plague broke out among the Mongol troops. According to accounts, the Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, attempting to spread the disease to the defenders. This may be one of the first instances of biological warfare. Whether or not this story is entirely accurate, plague did reach Kaffa, and from there spread to ships leaving their port. Genoese merchant ships fled Kaffa and sailed to Mediterranean ports. These ships carried infected rats and fleas. When they arrived at ports in Italy, Sicily, and other locations, the plague disembarked with them. The plague reached Sicily in October 1347. Sicily is an island in the Mediterranean Sea, part of modern Italy. Ships arriving from the east brought the disease. Within months it spread through Sicily and to mainland Italy. Italian cities like Genoa, Venice, and Florence were affected. From Italy the plague spread throughout Europe. It moved north into France, west into Spain, and eventually reached northern Europe, England, and Scandinavia. The spread followed trade routes and human travel patterns. Wherever people went, they could carry the disease with them. The plague reached France in 1348. France is a country in Western Europe. Paris, the capital, was severely affected. Contemporary accounts describe bodies piling up because there were too many dead to bury properly. Entire families were wiped out. Villages were abandoned. The social fabric of society was torn apart. England was reached by plague in June 1348. Ships arrived at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. From there, the disease spread inland. London was affected by autumn of 1348. King Edward III's daughter Joan died of plague in 1348, on her way to Spain to be married. Even royalty were not immune. The plague spread north to Scotland by 1349. Scotland is the northern part of the island of Great Britain. The Scots initially thought they were spared and even prepared to invade England, taking advantage of England's weakness. However, plague struck the Scottish army, killing many and forcing them to disperse. The retreating soldiers carried plague throughout Scotland. Scandinavia was reached by 1349. Ships from England brought plague to Norway. From Norway it spread to Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. Iceland's population was devastated. Some estimates suggest half the population died. Remote communities that seemed safe could be destroyed when one infected person arrived. The plague reached as far north as Greenland. Greenland is a large island in the North Atlantic. Norse settlers lived there in the 14th century. Archaeological evidence suggests the Norse settlements in Greenland disappeared around this time, possibly due to plague combined with other factors like climate change and loss of contact with Europe. Eastern Europe was also affected. Poland, Russia, and other regions experienced outbreaks. However, some areas had lower mortality, possibly due to lower population density, less trade contact, or other factors. The plague did not affect all regions equally. Some places were devastated while others were relatively spared. The initial wave of plague lasted from 1347 to 1351. During these years, millions died across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The pandemic then became endemic, meaning it continued to exist in the population at lower levels. Periodic outbreaks would occur for centuries afterward. Let us now examine what life was like during the plague in tedious detail designed to induce sleep. People living in the 14th century had no understanding of what caused plague. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know about fleas and rats being vectors of disease. They could only observe that people were getting sick and dying in enormous numbers. The experience of watching the plague arrive in your community must have been terrifying. You would hear reports from travelers about a terrible disease killing people in other cities. You would hear that entire families were dying, that bodies were piling up, that no one knew the cause or cure. You would hope and pray that the disease would not reach your town, that the first cases would appear. Perhaps a merchant who had travelled from an affected area would fall ill. He would develop fever and buboes. Within days he might be dead. Then his family members would fall ill, then their neighbours. The disease would spread through the community like wildfire. Doctors were helpless. Medical knowledge in the 14th century was based on ancient Greek and Roman texts. Physicians believed in the theory of humours as described in previous stories. They thought disease was caused by imbalances of bodily fluids. They had no concept of infectious microorganisms. Treatments were ineffective and sometimes harmful. Doctors might try bloodletting, thinking this would restore humoral balance. Bloodletting involves deliberately removing blood from a patient, usually by cutting a vein or applying leeches. This weakened patients who were already fighting a severe infection. It did not help and probably increased mortality. Other treatments included applying poultices to buboes. A poultice is a soft, moist mass applied to the body to relieve inflammation. Poultices made from various herbs were placed on the swollen lymph nodes. This did not cure the disease, but might have provided some comfort. Sometimes buboes would rupture and drain, which might slightly improve a patient's chances, but often the infection had already spread too far. Physicians wore special protective clothing that has become iconic. They wore long robes and masks with beak-like protrusions. The beak was filled with aromatic herbs and spices. Doctors believed that plague was caused by bad air, called miasma. They thought breathing through the herb-filled beak would protect them from the diseased air. This theory was wrong. Plague is not spread through bad air. It is spread by fleas and, in the pneumonic form, by respiratory droplets. However, the protective clothing may have provided some benefit. The long robes covered the physician's body, possibly reducing flea bites. The masks created some distance from patients, possibly reducing transmission of pneumonic plague. But these benefits were accidental, not understood. People tried many methods to protect themselves or cure the disease. Some carried flowers or herbs, believing pleasant smells would ward off bad air. Some burned aromatic substances in their homes. Some avoided bathing, believing that water opened skin pores and allowed disease to enter. This avoidance of bathing was counterproductive to hygiene, but was based on sincere misunderstanding. Religious explanations for the plague were common. Many people believed the plague was divine punishment for human sins. The church taught that God sent the plague to punish wickedness. The solution, according to this belief, was prayer, penance, and moral reform. Groups of flagellants travelled from town to town whipping themselves as penance. Flagellants were people who beat themselves with whips as a form of religious devotion, believing this suffering would atone for sins and persuade God to end the plague. They would march in processions, publicly whipping themselves until they bled. The flagellant movement became widespread in 1349. Groups of flagellants would arrive in a town, perform their rituals, and preach repentance. They attracted followers, but also criticism. The church eventually condemned the movement because the flagellants were operating outside church authority. But their existence shows the desperation people felt. Another response was scapegoating. Scapegoating is blaming a person or group for problems they did not cause. During the Black Plague, Jewish communities were blamed for the disease. Accusations spread that Jews had poisoned wells or were somehow responsible for the plague. These accusations were completely false but led to terrible violence. Pogroms occurred throughout Europe. Pogroms are organized massacres of a particular ethnic group, specifically Jews in this historical context. Jewish communities were attacked, their members killed, their property stolen. Thousands of Jews were murdered. Entire communities were destroyed. This violence was a horrific injustice based on fear, ignorance, and prejudice. The irony is that Jewish communities sometimes had lower plague mortality rates, possibly because Jewish religious law required ritual washing and other hygiene practices that inadvertently reduced disease transmission. But instead of learning from these practices, Christian populations blamed and attacked Jews. This demonstrates how fear can override reason and lead to terrible cruelty. Another response to plague was isolation. Some people fled cities for the countryside, hoping to escape the disease. This sometimes worked if they truly isolated themselves. A family might retreat to a rural estate and avoid all contact with others. If no one in the household was already infected, they might survive by remaining isolated until the outbreak passed. However, fleeing could also spread the disease. An infected person who fled might carry plague to a previously unaffected area. And fleeing was not an option for most people. Peasants were tied to the land and had nowhere to go. Urban workers could not afford to leave their employment. Only the wealthy had the resources to flee. Quarantine was attempted in some places. Quarantine means isolating people or goods that may carry disease to prevent its spread. The word comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Ships arriving in some ports were required to wait 40 days before passengers and cargo could disembark. This was an attempt to prevent plague from entering cities. The city of Ragusa, now called Dubrovnik in Croatia, established a quarantine system in 1377. This was after the worst of the initial outbreak, but during a period when plague was still recurring. Ships and travellers were isolated for 30 days, later extended to 40 days. This represented an early understanding that disease could be transmitted and that isolation could prevent spread. However, quarantine was difficult to enforce and was not always effective. People did not want to wait 40 days. Merchants lost money during delays. Enforcement required resources and authority that not all cities had. And if plague was already present in a community, quarantine of newcomers would not help. Within communities, households with plague victims were sometimes sealed. Authorities would lock infected families in their homes to prevent them from spreading disease. A mark might be painted on the door to warn others. Food would be left outside. The family would remain locked inside until all had either died or recovered. This practice was cruel, but reflected desperate attempts to contain the disease. Healthy family members would be locked in with the sick and dying. They would almost certainly become infected. They had to watch their loved ones die and wait to see if they would die too. Many entire families perished in these sealed houses. The psychological trauma of the plague was immense. Imagine watching your children die, knowing you can do nothing to save them. Imagine hearing the cries of the sick all around you. Imagine seeing corpses in the streets because the dying outnumbered the living, and there was no one to bury the dead. Social bonds broke down. Normal funeral rituals could not be observed. Bodies had to be disposed of quickly to prevent further spread of disease. Mass graves were dug and filled with hundreds or thousands of corpses. People were buried without proper rites, which was spiritually troubling in a deeply religious society. Some people abandoned their duties. Priests who should have administered last rites fled rather than risk infection. Doctors abandoned patients. Parents abandoned children. Fear overwhelmed. Social obligations. Not everyone acted this way. Many showed great courage and compassion, but the breakdown of normal social behavior was widespread. Others became fatalistic. If death seemed inevitable, why not enjoy life while you could? Some people engaged in reckless behavior, drinking, feasting, and pursuing pleasure while they still lived. Contemporary accounts describe parties and revelries, even as people died around them. This was perhaps a psychological coping mechanism, a denial of the horror. The economic impact was severe. So many people died that labour became scarce. Fields went unploughed because there were not enough workers. Crops rotted in the fields unharvested. Livestock wandered untended. Trade disrupted. Production of goods ceased. Prices for labour rose because workers were scarce, but prices for goods also rose because production was reduced. The feudal system was weakened. Feudalism, as described in earlier stories, was based on peasants being tied to land and owing labour to lords. When peasants died in huge numbers, the survivors could demand better terms. Lords needed workers and had to offer better pay, more freedom, or other incentives. This shift in bargaining power contributed to eventual decline of feudalism. Let us examine what people should have done to prevent and survive the plague. With modern knowledge, we can identify measures that would have been effective. However, we must remember that people at the time did not have this knowledge, so we cannot fault them for not taking these measures. The most important measure would have been controlling rat populations. Rats were the reservoir for the plague bacteria. Fleas on rats transmitted the disease to humans. If rat populations had been controlled, the plague would have spread much more slowly or not at all. But people did not know rats were involved. Rats lived in close association with humans, eating stored grain and garbage. Medieval cities and towns had abundant food sources for rats and few predators. Buildings provided shelter. Rat populations flourished. To control rats would have required understanding their role in disease transmission, which was not known until the late 19th century. Methods that would reduce rat populations include proper food storage, waste management, and building construction that excludes rodents. Grain should be stored in rat-proof containers. Garbage should be disposed of properly rather than thrown in streets. Buildings should be constructed with materials and methods that do not allow rodent entry. In the 14th century, food storage was often inadequate. Grain might be stored in wooden bins or sacks that rats could chew through. Garbage and human waste were often simply thrown into streets or into rivers. Buildings had gaps and holes that rats could enter easily. These conditions allowed rat populations to thrive in close proximity to humans. Another important measure would have been flea control. Even without understanding germ theory, reducing flea populations would have helped. Methods include keeping living spaces clean, washing clothing and bedding frequently, and personal hygiene. Fleas thrive in dirty environments with accumulated organic matter. However, as mentioned in previous stories, medieval Europeans often avoided bathing. They believed it was unhealthy or immoral. They wore the same clothes for extended periods. Bedding might not be washed frequently. These habits created ideal conditions for flea populations. More frequent washing and cleaning would have reduced fleas. Personal hygiene measures would include bathing regularly, washing hands before eating, and keeping fingernails clean. These simple measures reduce transmission of many diseases. However, the theory that led to these practices, germ theory, was not developed until the 19th century. People had no framework for understanding why hygiene mattered. Isolation of sick individuals would have helped. Keeping people with pneumonic plague away from healthy people would reduce airborne transmission. Keeping people with any form of plague isolated would reduce the chance of fleas moving from sick to healthy people. Proper quarantine procedures could have slowed the spread. Some of these measures were attempted, as described earlier, but enforcement was inconsistent and understanding was incomplete. More systematic and universal application of isolation and quarantine could have reduced mortality. However, this required social organization and authority that was often lacking or overwhelmed. For individuals who encountered sick people, avoiding direct contact would reduce transmission risk. Not touching plague victims, not handling their clothing or bedding, staying at a distance. These behaviors would help. However, compassion and duty often overrode self-preservation. Family members cared for their sick loved ones despite the risk. Avoiding fleas would have been helpful. This could include using insect repellents, though effective repellents were not available. Wearing clothing that covered the body would reduce skin exposed to flea bites. Sleeping off the ground and away from areas where fleas congregate would help. But again, people did not know fleas were vectors. For pneumonic plague specifically, avoiding the coughs and respiratory secretions of infected people would be critical. Wearing face coverings when near sick people, maintaining distance and ensuring good ventilation would reduce airborne transmission. Some of these measures were accidentally incorporated in plague doctor costumes. At a community level, proper disposal of bodies would be important. Corpses can harbour fleas. Allowing bodies to remain unburied or disposing of them carelessly could allow fleas to spread to new hosts. Prompt burial or cremation, with appropriate precautions for those handling bodies, would reduce this risk. Public health measures like providing clean water, managing waste, and maintaining cleanliness in public spaces would reduce disease transmission generally. Cities with better sanitation infrastructure would be healthier overall and better able to resist epidemic disease. However, medieval cities generally had poor sanitation. Water supplies were often contaminated. Wells could be polluted by nearby privies. Rivers used for drinking water also received sewage and garbage. Drinking contaminated water does not directly cause plague, but can cause other diseases that weaken people and make them more susceptible to plague. Waste management was primitive. Human and animal waste accumulated in streets. This attracted rats and flies, both of which can spread disease. Better waste disposal systems would improve public health. Some cities had rudimentary sewer systems, usually just ditches or channels leading to rivers, but many did not. Improving housing quality would help. Buildings with solid construction, good ventilation, and no gaps for rodents would provide healthier living environments. Overcrowding should be reduced. Multiple families living in small spaces facilitates disease transmission, but housing quality depended on wealth, and most people were poor. Nutrition affects disease resistance. Well-nourished people have stronger immune systems and are better able to fight off infections. Improving nutrition through better agriculture, food storage, and distribution would make populations healthier. However, agriculture was already limited by technology and environmental factors. Famines occurred periodically. Nutrition was often marginal. Medical treatment would ideally include antibiotics. Antibiotics are drugs that kill or inhibit bacteria. Modern antibiotics like streptomycin, gentamicin, and doxycycline are effective against Yersinia pestis. Treatment with appropriate antibiotics can reduce plague mortality dramatically. But antibiotics were not discovered until the 20th century. Without antibiotics, supportive care is important. This includes keeping patients hydrated, managing fever, providing pain relief, and treating complications. Hydration is critical because fever causes fluid loss. Medieval caregivers might have provided water or broth to sick people. This would help but would not cure the bacterial infection. Pain relief might have been provided through opium. Opium is derived from poppy plants and contains morphine, a powerful painkiller. Opium was known and used in medieval medicine. Providing opium to plague patients would reduce suffering even if it did not cure the disease. This was one of the few effective medical interventions available. Draining buboes might provide some relief and slightly improve survival chances. If a bubo is lanced and drained, it reduces the local bacterial load and pain. However, this procedure also risks spreading infection if not done carefully. Medieval surgeons might have performed this procedure with variable results. Rest is important for recovery from any illness. Allowing the body to focus energy on fighting infection rather than on activity can help. Plague patients should be kept comfortable and allowed to rest. This was understood in medieval times, and patients would be put to bed to rest. Avoiding stress would theoretically help immune function. Stress hormones can suppress immune response. However, experiencing plague was inherently stressful. The fear, pain, and knowledge that death was likely created enormous psychological stress that would impair immune function. There was no way to avoid this stress. Psychological and spiritual care was important even if it did not cure the disease. Providing comfort, reassurance, and companionship to the dying was compassionate and humane. Religious rites provided comfort to believers. These interventions addressed suffering even when they could not prevent death. At a societal level, maintaining social order would be important. Preventing panic, ensuring food distribution continues, maintaining law and order, these functions help communities survive crisis. However, plague mortality was so high that social structures often collapsed. There were not enough people to perform necessary functions. Preserving knowledge would be valuable. Recording what was observed about the disease could help future generations. Some contemporary chroniclers did document the plague. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron describes plague in Florence. These accounts provide historical information, though they did not help at the time. Planning for pandemics would be ideal, but was not done. If authorities had prepared emergency response plans, stockpiled supplies, trained personnel, and established protocols, the response might have been more effective. However, plague came as a surprise and overwhelmed unprepared societies. Communication about the disease would help. Sharing information about where plague was active, what symptoms looked like, and what measures might help would allow people to make informed decisions. However, communication was slow in medieval times. Information spread by word of mouth or occasional written messages. There were no newspapers or rapid communication systems. In summary, measures that would have helped include controlling rat populations, controlling flea populations, improving hygiene, isolating sick people, quarantining travellers and goods, avoiding contact with sick people's respiratory secretions, proper disposal of bodies, improving sanitation, improving housing, improving nutrition, providing antibiotics if available, providing supportive medical care, maintaining social order, and communicating information. Most of these measures were not possible or not understood in the 14th century. The plague eventually declined for reasons that are not entirely clear. Rat populations may have changed. The bacteria may have evolved to become less virulent. Human populations may have developed some immunity. Quarantine and isolation measures may have had some effect. Climate may have played a role. Likely it was a combination of factors. However, plague did not disappear entirely. It remained endemic in some areas and caused periodic outbreaks for centuries. Major plague outbreaks occurred in London in 1665, in Marseille in 1720, and in China and India in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Plague still exists today, but is rare and treatable with antibiotics. The Black Death of the 14th century was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history. It killed perhaps half of Europe's population. It caused enormous suffering. It disrupted societies, economies, and cultures. It demonstrated human vulnerability to infectious disease. The plague also demonstrated human resilience. Societies recovered. Populations rebounded. People continued living, working, and building. The experience of plague may have contributed to changes in European society, including the eventual decline of feudalism and the development of new economic and social structures. Understanding the Black Plague helps us appreciate the importance of public health, medical science, and preparedness for infectious disease. Modern sanitation, vaccines, antibiotics, and disease surveillance have dramatically reduced deaths from infectious disease. But we remain vulnerable to new diseases, as recent pandemics have shown. The boring details of plague, how bacteria multiply, how fleas transmit disease, how buboes form, how societies respond to crisis. These details reveal the complexity of pandemic disease. They show that simple answers are inadequate. They show that multiple factors interact to determine outcomes. They show that knowledge and preparation matter. If you have read this far through this exhaustive examination of plague in all its tedious detail, you're either deeply asleep or remarkably patient. The Black Plague was terrible. It killed millions. People suffered immensely. They did not know what caused it or how to stop it. What they should have done requires knowledge they did not possess, but they survived through endurance, adaptation, and human resilience. Sleep now, grateful for modern medicine, sanitation, and knowledge that protect you from such devastating disease. The Black Death is history. We have learned from it. We are safer because of that learning, though not completely safe. Rest well, knowing the boring details of how plague bacteria infect cells, how immune systems respond, and how societies cope with crisis. Good night, and may you never experience anything like the Black Plague. The story is complete. Sleep peacefully. But there is much more to examine about the Black Plague in tedious detail to ensure maximum sleep induction. Let us continue exploring every aspect of this devastating pandemic with exhaustive repetition and boring specificity. The symptoms of plague deserve even more detailed examination. When a person was bitten by an infected flea, the bacteria would enter through the bite wound. The bite itself might be small and initially unnoticed. Fleas are tiny insects. Their bites are much smaller than mosquito bites. A person might not realize they had been bitten. After the bite, there would be an incubation period. An incubation period is the time between infection and the appearance of symptoms. For bubonic plague, the incubation period is typically 2 to 6 days. During this time, the bacteria are multiplying in the body, but the person feels fine. They do not know they are infected. When symptoms begin, the first sign is often fever. The fever would come on suddenly. The person might feel fine in the morning and have high fever by evening. Along with fever comes chills. The person feels cold even though their body temperature is elevated. They might shiver uncontrollably. Headache develops. The headache is often severe, throbbing, and persistent. Pain relievers like aspirin did not exist in the 14th century. The person would have to endure the headache with no relief. They might place cool cloths on their forehead, which provided minimal comfort. Weakness and fatigue set in. The person feels profoundly tired. Their muscles feel weak. Standing or walking requires great effort. They want to lie down and rest. This weakness is the body's response to fighting the infection. Energy is diverted to the immune system. The most characteristic symptom of bubonic plague is the bubo. As bacteria spread from the bite site to nearby lymph nodes, the nodes begin to swell. The swelling is progressive. Over hours, a small lump becomes a large, painful mass. The skin over the bubo becomes red, hot, and tender. The location of the bubo depends on where the flea bite occurred. If bitten on the leg, the bubo would typically appear in the groin. If bitten on the arm, the bubo would appear in the armpit. If bitten on the neck or face, the bubo would appear on the neck. The bubo forms at the lymph nodes, draining the area where the bite occurred. The pain of the bubo is intense. Contemporary accounts describe the pain as excruciating. The swollen lymph node presses on surrounding tissues and nerves. Any movement of the area causes pain. A bubo in the groin makes walking painful. A bubo in the armpit makes moving the arm painful. The pain is constant and severe. As the bubo enlarges, it becomes more visible. It protrudes noticeably. The skin stretches over the swelling. In some cases, the skin over the bubo may break open and drain pus and blood. This drainage might provide some relief from pressure and pain, but it also releases bacteria that could infect others or cause further spread in the patient. In some cases, multiple buboes would develop. A person might have swelling in both the groin and armpit if there were multiple flea bites, or if the infection spread through the lymphatic system. Multiple buboes meant more pain and more advanced infection. Other symptoms could include nausea and vomiting. Nausea is the feeling of needing to vomit. Vomiting is forcefully expelling stomach contents through the mouth. These symptoms result from toxins produced by bacteria and from the body's inflammatory response. The person cannot keep food down. they become dehydrated. Dehydration occurs when the body loses more fluid than it takes in. Fever causes sweating, which loses fluid. Vomiting loses fluid. Decreased drinking due to illness means less fluid intake. Dehydration causes dry mouth, decreased urination, dizziness, and weakness. Severe dehydration can lead to shock and organ failure. Abdominal pain might occur. The abdomen is the part of the body containing the stomach, intestines, and other organs. Pain in the abdomen can indicate that infection has spread to lymph nodes in the abdomen or that organs are affected. Abdominal pain was a bad sign indicating advanced disease. As the disease progressed, some people would develop septicemia. The bacteria enter the bloodstream and circulate throughout the body. This causes septic shock. Septic shock is a life-threatening condition characterized by dangerously low blood pressure, rapid heart rate, rapid breathing, and altered mental status. Blood pressure is the force of blood against artery walls. Normal blood pressure is necessary to deliver oxygen and nutrients to organs. When blood pressure drops too low, organs do not receive adequate blood flow. They begin to fail. Kidneys stop filtering blood. The liver stops processing toxins. The brain does not receive enough oxygen. Altered mental status means changes in consciousness or cognition. The person might become confused, disoriented, or unresponsive. They might not recognize family members. They might say things that do not make sense. This indicates that the brain is not functioning properly due to inadequate blood flow or toxins in the bloodstream. Bleeding under the skin causes discoloration. Small hemorrhages create purple spots called petechiae. Larger hemorrhages create purple patches called purpura. These spots and patches can appear anywhere on the body. They are caused by bacteria damaging blood vessel walls, allowing blood to leak into surrounding tissues. In severe cases, bleeding occurs from body openings. A person might bleed from the nose, mouth, or rectum. They might cough up blood. They might have bloody diarrhea. This bleeding indicates that blood vessels throughout the body are damaged and failing. It is a terminal sign. Gangrene could develop in fingers, toes, nose, or other extremities. The tissue turns black as cells die. The dead tissue has a distinctive foul smell. If the person survives the initial infection, the gangrenous tissue would need to be removed, which in medieval times meant amputation with crude tools and no anesthesia. The progression from initial symptoms to death typically took 3 to 5 days for bubonic plague. Some people died more quickly. A few survived longer. The speed of progression depended on factors like the size of the bacterial load, the individual's immune response, and whether complications like septicemia developed. For pneumonic plague, the progression was even faster. After inhaling bacteria, symptoms might appear within 1 to 3 days. The first symptoms would be fever, headache, and weakness, similar to bubonic plague. But quickly, respiratory symptoms would develop. Coughing would begin. At first, it might be a dry cough. Soon, it would become productive, meaning the person coughs up sputum. The sputum would be blood-tinged, giving it a pink or red colour. This is because the infection in the lungs causes bleeding. Chest pain accompanies the cough. The pain is caused by inflammation in the lungs and pleura. The pleura are membranes surrounding the lungs. When inflamed, they cause sharp pain with breathing. Deep breaths are painful, so the person takes shallow breaths. Shortness of breath develops. The person feels like they cannot get enough air. This is because the infected lungs are not exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide efficiently. Areas of lung are filled with fluid and bacteria instead of air. The person breathes rapidly, trying to compensate. As pneumonic plague progresses, breathing becomes more and more difficult. The person gasps for air. They might become cyanotic, meaning their skin turns bluish due to lack of oxygen in the blood. They are essentially drowning in fluid and blood in their own lungs. Pneumonic plague victims died within 1 to 3 days usually. The rapid progression meant that a person could seem healthy one day, develop symptoms the next day, and be dead the day after. This speed was terrifying to witnesses. There was no time to prepare, no time to say goodbye. For caregivers watching a loved one die of plague, the experience was traumatic. They would see the person suffering, the pain, the fever, the coughing up of blood, the gasping for breath. They would be unable to provide meaningful relief. They could offer water, wipe the person's brow, hold their hand, but they could not stop the disease, and the caregiver knew they were at risk themselves. Being in close contact with a plague victim increased the chance of infection. Every cough sent bacteria into the air. Touching the person, or their clothing, could transfer fleas. The caregiver had to choose between protecting themselves and caring for their loved one. Many people chose to care for family despite the risk. Parents tended to sick children. Children cared for sick parents. Spouses nursed each other. This compassion and devotion was admirable, but also meant that entire families often died together. The disease would spread from one family member to another until all were gone. Some people fled from sick family members. Fear overcame love and duty. They abandoned spouses, parents, or children to die alone. Contemporary writers condemned this behavior as immoral and cowardly. But the terror was real. The instinct for self-preservation is powerful. Those who survived, watching family members die, were left traumatized and often alone. A person might lose their spouse, all their children, their parents, their siblings. Their entire family structure would be destroyed. They would be left isolated in a world where death was everywhere. The grief would be profound. Grief is the emotional response to loss. Losing one family member is devastating. Losing multiple family members in quick succession is almost unbearable, and the usual mourning rituals could not be performed, which made the grief even harder to process. Normal funerals involved washing and preparing the body, holding a wake where people paid respects, having a religious service, and burial in consecrated ground with prayers and rituals. These steps helped the living accept the death and find closure. But during plague, none of this was possible. Bodies were often taken away quickly with minimal ceremony. They were thrown into mass graves. There might be no priest to perform last rites, because priests were overwhelmed or had fled. Families could not gather to mourn because gathering spread disease. The dead were disposed of like garbage, not honoured like humans. This lack of proper burial was spiritually troubling. Medieval people believed that proper burial and religious rites affected the soul's fate in the afterlife. A person buried without rites might not reach heaven. This added spiritual anguish to the emotional grief. Survivors also faced practical challenges. If the family breadwinner died, how would the survivors eat? If parents died, who would care for orphaned children? If a craftsman died, who would continue the business? The economic and social structures that supported daily life were shattered. Children orphaned by plague faced grim prospects. If no relatives could take them in, they might be left to fend for themselves. Orphanages were rare and poorly funded. Many orphan children became beggars or died of starvation or exposure. The lucky ones might be taken in by neighbours or institutions. The psychological impact on children who survived plague was severe. Imagine being a child watching your parents die, perhaps watching your siblings die, and being left alone in a terrifying world. The trauma would be profound and lasting. Many plague survivors, both children and adults, were psychologically scarred for life. Let us examine the economic consequences of the plague in more tedious detail. The immediate economic impact was the loss of workers. When a third to half of the population dies, there are not enough people to perform all the work that society requires. Fields went unploughed, crops went unharvested, workshops closed, markets shut down. Agriculture was particularly affected. Most people in medieval Europe were involved in farming. When farmers died in large numbers, agricultural production collapsed. There were not enough people to plant seeds in spring, not enough people to weed fields in summer, not enough people to harvest grain in autumn. Livestock suffered. With fewer people to tend them, animals wandered, starved, or fell prey to predators. Sheep needed shearing, but there were not enough shepherds. Cows needed milking, but there were not enough dairy workers. Pigs needed feeding, but there were not enough swineherds. Animal populations declined. The harvest failure led to food shortages. Less grain was produced. Less food was available. Prices for food rose dramatically. Those who survived plague faced potential starvation because there was not enough food. The irony was that there were fewer people to feed, but also much less food being produced. In some areas, fields returned to wilderness. With no one to maintain them, cultivated land became overgrown. Forests reclaimed areas that had been farmland. Villages were abandoned. Buildings fell into ruin. The landscape changed as human presence diminished. Trade was disrupted. Merchants who carried goods between cities could also carry plague. Fear of contagion led to restrictions on travel and trade. Goods piled up in warehouses because there was no one to transport or sell them, or they could not be transported because the roads were unsafe, or the destination city had closed its gates. Cities sometimes closed their gates during plague outbreaks, not allowing anyone to enter or leave. This was an attempt at quarantine, but it also meant that trade stopped. Food and other necessities could not enter the city. If the city did not have adequate stockpiles, residents could starve even if they did not die of plague. Craftsmen and artisans died in large numbers. When a skilled craftsman died, their knowledge and skills died with them. If a master blacksmith died, who would make tools and horseshoes? If a master weaver died, who would produce cloth? Apprentices might not have learned enough to replace their masters. Some crafts and skills were lost. Specific techniques that only a few people knew might disappear when those people died. Later generations would have to redevelop or reinvent these skills. This represented a loss of human knowledge and capability. The labour shortage that resulted from plague mortality changed the economic balance of power. Before plague, labour was abundant and cheap. Lords and employers could pay low wages because workers had little bargaining power. But after plague killed so many workers, labour became scarce and valuable. Surviving workers could demand higher wages. If an employer would not pay what they asked, they could find another employer who would. This was a dramatic shift. For the first time in generations, ordinary workers had leverage. They used it to improve their conditions. Laws were passed trying to limit wages. In England, the Statute of Labourers in 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. Similar laws were passed in other countries. These laws tried to prevent workers from demanding higher pay, but they were difficult to enforce because employers needed workers and were willing to pay more to get them. Peasants who had been bound to land as serfs could negotiate for freedom. They could threaten to leave if the lord did not release them from serfdom. Lords needed workers and often had to agree. This accelerated the decline of serfdom and the rise of free labour. The plague thus had unintended social consequences. It empowered the lower classes economically. It weakened the feudal system. It contributed to the eventual transition to different economic and social structures. These changes took many decades to fully manifest, but the seeds were planted during and after the plague. The church also faced economic consequences. The church was a major landowner. Its lands needed to be worked. When peasants died, the church's estates lost workers and productivity declined. The church's income from tithes and rents decreased. The church became relatively poorer. Many clergy died during the plague. Priests who administered to the sick and dying were exposed to infection. Some died from bubonic plague caught from flea bites while visiting parishioners. Many died from pneumonic plague caught from hearing the confessions of dying patients who coughed in their faces. The high mortality among clergy created a shortage of priests. Positions had to be filled quickly to serve the religious needs of the population. Standards for ordination were lowered. Less educated and less trained men became priests. This may have reduced the overall quality of clergy and contributed to later problems in the church. The plague also affected faith. Some people lost faith in God. If God was supposed to be loving and just, why did he send such terrible suffering? Why did innocent children die? Why did prayers go unanswered? These questions led some people to doubt. Others became more devout. They interpreted the plague as divine punishment and believed the solution was greater piety. They prayed more, attended church more, gave more to the church. They hoped that increased devotion would persuade God to end the plague. Religious movements proliferated. Some people joined mystical movements seeking direct experience of God. Some joined movements that criticized the church. The plague created religious ferment and questioning that contributed to eventual religious changes in Europe. The cultural impact of plague was also significant. Art and literature from the period reflect the omnipresence of death. The danse macabre, or dance of death, was an artistic motif showing death as a skeleton leading people of all social classes in a dance. It reminded people that death comes to everyone regardless of status. Literature often featured themes of mortality and the transience of life. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague, tells stories of people fleeing plague in Florence. The stories are entertaining, but they are framed by the horror of plague. The contrast between the stories and the frame emphasizes the human need for distraction from terror. The plague may have influenced the development of Renaissance humanism. Humanism emphasized human dignity, reason, and worldly concerns rather than just religious devotion and the afterlife. The plague's devastation may have prompted people to focus more on the human experience and less on divine will. Architecture was affected. Fewer buildings were constructed during and immediately after plague because there were fewer workers and less money. Some grand projects were abandoned. Churches that had been under construction for decades might never be completed. The plague influenced medical thought eventually, though not immediately. Doctors who lived through plague observed that it seemed to spread from person to person, and that isolation could sometimes prevent infection. These observations contradicted prevailing miasma theory, which held that disease came from bad air rather than from contagion. It took centuries for germ theory to develop from these early observations, but the plague experience contributed to the slow accumulation of knowledge that disease could be contagious. This knowledge would eventually lead to better understanding and better disease control. Let us examine specific examples of how individuals experienced and survived the plague. While we cannot know every detail of individual experiences from 7 centuries ago, we can reconstruct typical scenarios based on historical accounts. Consider a peasant farmer named John who lived in an English village in 1348. John lived in a small cottage with his wife Mary and their 3 children. They grew grain and vegetables, kept a few chickens, and worked in the Lord's fields several days per week, as required by their feudal obligations. In the summer of 1348, John heard troubling news from travellers. A terrible disease was killing people in London and spreading through the countryside. Entire villages had been wiped out. No one knew what caused it or how to stop it. John and Mary prayed that their village would be spared. By autumn the plague arrived. A travelling merchant who passed through the village fell ill. Within days he was dead. Then others in the village began falling sick. A family living near John's cottage was affected. First the father developed fever and painful swelling in his groin. He died 3 days later. Then his wife and 2 children fell ill, all dead within a week. John and Mary kept their children inside, avoiding contact with others. But it was impossible to fully isolate. They still needed to get water from the village well. They still had chickens to tend, and John had to work in the Lord's fields or face punishment. One morning, John woke with a headache and chills. By afternoon he had high fever. By evening a painful lump had appeared in his armpit. Mary knew what this meant. She had seen the symptoms in neighbours. John had plague. Mary cared for John as best she could. She gave him water. She placed cool cloths on his burning forehead. She prayed, but she could do nothing to stop the disease. The bubo in John's armpit grew larger and more painful. He moaned in agony. His fever soared. On the 3rd day the bubo ruptured and drained foul-smelling pus mixed with blood. John seemed slightly better for a few hours, but then he worsened rapidly. He became confused, did not recognize Mary. His breathing became laboured. By nightfall, he was dead. Mary was left with 3 young children and no way to support them. She had to bury John herself, wrapping his body in a sheet and dragging it to the village burial ground. There was no priest available to perform rites. There were too many dead. Within 2 weeks, Mary's eldest child developed plague. The child died after 4 days of suffering. Then the second child fell ill and died. Mary was frantic with grief and terror. She had lost her husband and 2 children. Only her youngest, a toddler, remained. Mary and her youngest child survived. Why? they did not get sick when others in the family did is unclear. Perhaps they had some natural immunity. Perhaps they were lucky and avoided flea bites. Perhaps they received a lower dose of bacteria. They survived. But Mary's life was shattered. She had lost her husband and 2 of her children. Her cottage and fields needed work, but she was a widow with an infant. The Lord's estate was also short of workers. The Lord's steward offered Mary better terms if she would continue working the land. She had no choice but to accept. Over the following years, Mary remarried to another plague survivor whose wife had died. They combined their households and resources. Life continued, but the memory of plague haunted them. Mary had nightmares about watching her children die. She lived in fear that plague might return. This story is fictional but representative. Countless families experienced similar tragedies. Some families were entirely wiped out. Some had a few survivors like Mary. The survivors had to rebuild their lives while carrying profound grief and trauma. Another scenario involves a physician. Consider Dr. Thomas, a university-educated physician practicing in a French city. When plague arrived in his city in 1348, Thomas was called upon to treat patients. He understood, based on his medical training, that plague was a serious humoral imbalance requiring aggressive treatment. Thomas treated patients by bloodletting, applying poultices, and prescribing herbal remedies. None of these treatments were effective, and Thomas watched patient after patient die. He became frustrated and frightened. The disease did not respond to the treatments that should work according to medical theory. Thomas acquired protective clothing, a long waxed coat, gloves, and a beaked mask filled with aromatic herbs. He believed this would protect him from the diseased air. He visited patients in their homes, examined their buboes, and gave advice to families. Despite his precautions, Thomas eventually contracted plague. Perhaps a flea bit him through his clothing. Perhaps he inhaled bacteria from a patient with pneumonic plague. He developed fever and a bubo in his groin. He knew what this meant. As a physician, he knew the likely outcome. Thomas prepared for death. He made his will, leaving his books and instruments to a younger physician. He confessed his sins to a priest. He said goodbye to his family. Then he lay in bed, waiting to die. But Thomas did not die. His fever broke after 4 days. The bubo drained and gradually healed. He was weak and exhausted, but he survived. He was one of the fortunate minority who recovered from bubonic plague. After recovering, Thomas returned to treating plague patients. He may have had some immunity from surviving the disease. He helped as many people as he could, though he could rarely cure them. He witnessed immense suffering and death. The experience changed him, made him more humble about the limits of medical knowledge. These individual stories, whether about John and Mary or Dr. Thomas, illustrate the human dimension of the plague. Statistics about millions of deaths are hard to comprehend. Individual stories make the tragedy tangible. Each death was a person with a life, a story, people who loved them. If you're still reading this exceptionally long and boring account of plague, you're either asleep and dreaming of medieval pestilence, or you have extraordinary tolerance for tedious historical detail. The plague was devastating. It killed millions. It caused immense suffering. People tried to survive using the knowledge they had, which was insufficient. Many died. Some survived. Life continued. The lessons from plague remain relevant. infectious disease can devastate populations. Public health measures like sanitation and isolation can help control disease. Medical knowledge is essential. Preparation for pandemics is important. These lessons, bought with millions of lives, should not be forgotten. Sleep now, grateful for modern medicine, antibiotics, vaccines, and public health systems that protect you from diseases like plague. The Black Death is history, but its lessons endure. Rest peacefully, free from buboes, fever, and medieval suffering. Good night, and may you dream of health, not pestilence. Yet there remains more to explore about the Black Plague in mind-numbing detail to ensure complete sleepiness. Let us continue examining every tedious aspect of medieval plague with exhaustive thoroughness. The medieval understanding of disease was fundamentally different from modern understanding. Medieval physicians relied on texts from ancient Greece and Rome, particularly the works of Hippocrates and Galen. These texts described diseases resulting from imbalances in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to humoral theory, health required these four humours to be in proper balance. Too much or too little of any humour caused disease. Different diseases resulted from different imbalances. Treatment aimed to restore balance through diet, herbs, bleeding, purging, or other interventions. This theory was completely wrong. There are no four humours. Blood is real, but phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile as distinct humours are misconceptions based on observation of bodily fluids without understanding their actual nature and origins. The theory persisted because it seemed to explain observations, and because no better theory existed. When plague arrived, physicians attempted to understand it within the humoral framework. Perhaps plague was caused by excess black bile, making it a melancholic disease, or perhaps it involved overheating of blood. Different physicians had different theories, all based on the same flawed fundamental assumption. Another prevalent theory was miasma theory. Miasma means bad air or pollution. People believed that diseases, including plague, were caused by breathing foul air arising from rotting matter, swamps, or other sources. This theory seemed logical based on observation that disease often occurred in areas with bad smells. Miasma theory was partially correct in that poor sanitation and bad smells often correlated with disease. Areas with accumulated waste, polluted water, and decomposing matter did tend to have more disease. But the connection was not through bad air. It was through contaminated water, disease-carrying insects and rodents, and direct transmission of pathogens. The miasma theory led to some beneficial practices. Efforts to reduce bad smells through cleaning, ventilation, and waste removal did improve sanitation and reduce some disease transmission. But the theory also led to ineffective measures like carrying sweet-smelling herbs or wearing perfume-soaked cloth over the nose. Astrology was also invoked to explain plague. Astrology is the belief that positions of celestial bodies influence human affairs and natural events. Medieval people widely believed in astrology. When plague struck, astrologers looked for celestial explanations. Some astrologers blamed the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345. A conjunction is when planets appear close together in the sky, as viewed from Earth. This astronomical event was thought to have corrupted the air and caused plague. This explanation was nonsense. Planetary positions have no effect on disease. The belief that God sent plague as punishment for sin was widespread. This religious explanation provided meaning for the suffering. It suggested that moral reform and prayer could end the plague. It gave people something to do: pray, repent, perform penance, even if these actions had no medical effect. The religious explanation had social consequences. It led to scapegoating of groups blamed for sins: Jews, lepers, beggars, and others. It led to flagellant movements. It led to increased donations to the church and religious activities. These responses did not stop plague, but they shaped how societies reacted. Let us examine the actual mechanism of plague transmission in more detail. Modern understanding reveals the complex ecology of plague. Yersinia pestis bacteria normally circulate in populations of wild rodents in certain regions. These regions are called enzootic foci. Enzootic means the disease is normally present in animal populations. In these enzootic areas, fleas transmit bacteria between rodents. The rodent population reaches equilibrium with the bacteria. Some rodents die, but the population persists. The bacteria persist at relatively low levels. This is the normal state of the plague bacteria-rodent-flea ecosystem. Occasionally conditions change and bacteria multiply more rapidly in rodent populations. This creates an epizootic, an epidemic in animal populations. Large numbers of rodents die. When the normal rodent hosts die, fleas must find new hosts. They may jump to other rodent species or to humans. Rat species differ in their susceptibility to plague and their association with humans. The black rat, Rattus rattus, lives in close association with humans, nesting in buildings and eating human food. When plague-infected fleas bite black rats living near humans, the disease can easily spill over to humans. The flea species also matter. The most important flea for plague transmission is Xenopsilla chaopes, the oriental rat flea. This flea readily bites both rats and humans. When it feeds on an infected rat, bacteria multiply in the flea's digestive system. When the flea bites a human, it can transmit large numbers of bacteria. The temperature affects flea biology and plague transmission. Fleas are most active and reproduce most rapidly in warm weather, typically between 20 and 28 degrees Celsius. This is why plague often occurs in warmer months. However, fleas can survive in human dwellings during winter, allowing plague to persist year-round in some areas. Human living conditions affected plague transmission. Overcrowded housing with poor sanitation provided ideal conditions for rats and fleas. Multiple families living in small spaces meant more people exposed to each infected flea. Straw bedding and rushes on floors provided hiding places for fleas. Clothing worn continuously without washing harboured fleas. Medieval Europeans changed clothes infrequently and bathed rarely. Their clothing would accumulate fleas over time. These fleas could bite repeatedly, increasing chance of transmission. Washing clothes and bodies regularly would have reduced flea populations. The movement of people and goods spread plague geographically. Traders travelling between cities carried goods in packages that could harbour fleas. The fleas could survive the journey and infect people at the destination. Ships were particularly effective at transporting rats and fleas across long distances. Ships had dark holds filled with cargo and food supplies. Rats lived in these holds, eating stored grain and breeding. Fleas lived on the rats. When ships docked, rats could leave the ship via mooring ropes or by jumping to shore. They would establish populations in the new location, bringing plague with them. The speed of plague spread across Europe in 1347 to 1351, averaged about 4 kilometres per day. This seems slow by modern standards, but was limited by medieval travel speeds. People walked or rode horses. Ships sailed when wind permitted. The plague moved as fast as people and rats could travel. Some geographic barriers slowed plague. Mountains were difficult to cross and had lower population density. Plague moved more slowly across mountainous regions. Islands could sometimes be protected if they strictly controlled ship arrivals, but no barrier was perfect. Eventually, plague reached almost everywhere. Seasonal patterns affected plague spread. Plague transmission was most efficient in warm months when fleas were active. In cold winters, flea activity decreased and plague transmission slowed. This created seasonal variation in plague, mortality, with peaks in summer and autumn. Reinfection was possible. Surviving plague might provide some immunity, but the immunity was not perfect or permanent. People could get plague multiple times. Some people survived first infection only to die in a later outbreak. The bacteria can also mutate, potentially evading immune responses. Let us now examine specific historical outbreaks in even more tedious detail. The plague of Justinian in 541 to 542 CE was an earlier pandemic of plague. It killed millions in the Byzantine Empire and surrounding regions. After this pandemic, plague recurred periodically for about 2 centuries, before apparently disappearing for several hundred years. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 was probably not caused by a reintroduction of the same bacterial strain. Genetic analysis of bacteria from plague victims suggests the Black Death strain was related to but distinct from the Justinian strain. This indicates plague persisted somewhere in animal populations between the two pandemics. During the Black Death, different regions experienced different mortality rates. Urban areas generally had higher mortality than rural areas. Cities were more crowded, with more rats and fleas, facilitating transmission. Rural areas were less dense, and some people could isolate themselves more effectively. Italy was hit hard, with some cities losing half their population. Florence may have lost 60% of its population. Venice lost 60%. Siena lost half its population. The scale of death in Italian cities was almost incomprehensible. Streets filled with corpses, entire neighbourhoods emptied. France also suffered enormously. Paris may have lost a third of its population. Avignon, where the Pope resided at the time, was devastated. Pope Clement VI survived, as did some of his court, but many died. The Pope consecrated the Rhone River so bodies could be thrown in it when burial capacity was exceeded. England lost approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of its population. London was severely affected. Bristol, Norwich, and other cities suffered mass mortality. Rural England also lost many people. Entire villages were abandoned. The landscape was marked by deserted settlements for generations. The Low Countries, modern Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg, had high mortality. Bruges may have lost a third of its population. Ghent and other cities were hard hit. The dense urban populations and active trade networks facilitated plague spread. Germany and Central Europe experienced varied mortality. Some regions lost half their population. Others had lower mortality. The pattern was uneven, possibly due to differences in population density, trade connections, and timing of outbreaks. Eastern Europe generally had lower mortality than Western Europe. though still substantial. Poland, Hungary, and regions further east were affected, but not as devastated. Lower population density and less international trade may have slowed plague spread in these regions. Scandinavia lost perhaps a third of its population. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark all experienced severe outbreaks. Iceland was particularly hard hit, possibly losing half its population. The isolation that usually protected islands became a trap when plague arrived. Spain lost approximately one-third of its population. Barcelona, Valencia, and other cities suffered severe mortality. The Iberian Peninsula's position on Mediterranean trade routes ensured early exposure to plague. North Africa was affected, but records are less complete. Egypt lost a substantial portion of its population. Cairo, a major city, was devastated. The same trade routes that brought wealth brought plague. The Middle East experienced plague as well. Syria, Palestine, and Mesopotamia had outbreaks. Jerusalem, Damascus, and other cities lost large portions of their populations. The disruption contributed to political and economic instability in the region. After the initial pandemic of 1347 to 1351, plague did not disappear. It became endemic in Europe, causing periodic outbreaks for the next 4 centuries. These subsequent outbreaks are sometimes called the Second Pandemic, with the initial Black Death being the first wave of this pandemic. Major plague outbreaks occurred in London in 1563, 1593, 1603, 1625, and 1665. The Great Plague of London in 1665 killed perhaps 100,000 people, about a quarter of London's population. Each outbreak brought renewed horror and mortality, though never matching the Black Death's devastation. Plague struck Venice repeatedly. Outbreaks occurred in 1575 to 1577 and 1629 to 1631. The 1629 to 1631 outbreak killed about one-third of Venice's population. The city built churches commemorating deliverance from plague, like Santa Maria della Salute. Marseille experienced a major plague outbreak in 1720 to 1722. A ship arrived from the Levant carrying plague. Despite quarantine attempts, the disease entered the city. Perhaps 100,000 people died in Marseille and surrounding regions. This was one of the last major plague outbreaks in Western Europe. Why did plague eventually decline in Western Europe? Several factors probably contributed. Building standards improved, creating fewer hiding places for rats. Brick and stone buildings replaced wooden structures. Ships became cleaner. Quarantine practices improved. The replacement of black rats by brown rats may have mattered, as brown rats are less likely to live in close contact with humans. Public health understanding slowly improved. Although germ theory was not developed until the 19th century, people did observe that plague seemed contagious and that isolation helped. Quarantine became more systematic. Plague houses were marked. Infected families were isolated. These measures, though crude, had some effect. The third pandemic of plague began in China in the 1850s and spread globally via steamships in the late 19th century. This outbreak led to the identification of Yersinia pestis as the cause of plague by Alexandra Yersin and Kitasato Shibasaburo in 1894. Finally, after thousands of years of plague epidemics, humans understood what caused the disease. Understanding the cause enabled development of antibiotics effective against plague. Streptomycin, discovered in 1943, was the first antibiotic effective against Yersinia pestis. Other antibiotics, including gentamicin and doxycycline, also work. With prompt antibiotic treatment, plague mortality is now very low. Plague still exists today. It persists in wild rodent populations in parts of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Hundreds of cases occur annually worldwide. Most are bubonic plague in rural areas where people contact infected animals or fleas. Prompt treatment with antibiotics usually cures the infection. However, pneumonic plague remains dangerous even with modern medicine. If not treated within 24 hours of symptom onset, mortality is high even with antibiotics. This is because the infection progresses so rapidly that organs are damaged before antibiotics can work. Plague is considered a potential bioterrorism agent. The bacteria could theoretically be weaponized and released in aerosol form, causing pneumonic plague. Public health systems monitor for unusual disease outbreaks and maintain stockpiles of antibiotics for rapid response to such threats. The historical experience with plague teaches important lessons for modern pandemic preparedness. Infectious diseases can emerge unexpectedly and spread rapidly. They can overwhelm medical systems and kill enormous numbers. Social, economic, and political systems can be disrupted. Effective responses require accurate understanding of disease transmission. Medieval people lacked this understanding, and their responses were often ineffective or counterproductive. Modern microbiology and epidemiology provide the knowledge needed for effective interventions. Public health infrastructure is essential. Systems for disease, surveillance, laboratory diagnosis, isolation and treatment of patients, contact tracing, and public communication can limit disease spread. These systems require sustained investment and must be in place before emergencies occur. Scientific research is critical. Understanding disease biology enables development of treatments and vaccines. The transition from helplessness against plague in the 14th century to effective treatment today resulted from scientific advances. Continued research is necessary to address emerging diseases. Global coordination matters. Diseases do not respect national borders. Plague spread along medieval trade routes. Modern diseases spread via international travel. Effective pandemic response requires cooperation between countries, sharing of information and resources, and collective action. If you're still reading this exceptionally lengthy and deliberately soporific account of plague in all its tedious detail, you have remarkable endurance. More likely you fell asleep long ago, which was the intended purpose. The Black Plague killed millions, caused immense suffering, and transformed medieval society. Modern medicine has reduced the threat, but vigilance remains necessary. Sleep well, protected by antibiotics, sanitation, and public health systems that medieval people could not imagine. The plague is history for most of the world, confined to occasional cases in remote areas. Rest peacefully, free from the terror that gripped Europe in 1348. The boring details of bacterial biology, flea transmission, and medieval suffering have been thoroughly explored. Good night, but we must continue examining every last aspect of the Black Plague in exhaustive and sleep-inducing detail to ensure complete thoroughness. There remains much more boring information to cover about this devastating pandemic. The burial practices during plague deserve more detailed examination. In normal times, burial was a ritualized process with specific religious and social customs. Bodies would be washed and prepared by family members. The body would lie in state at home while people paid respects. A funeral procession would carry the body to the church. A priest would perform funeral rites. The body would be buried in consecrated ground in the churchyard. This process served important functions. It allowed family and community to mourn together. It provided closure. It honored the deceased. It affirmed religious beliefs about death and afterlife. The rituals helped the living cope with loss and reintegrate into normal life after the disruption of death. During plague, none of this was possible. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be properly buried. Gravediggers could not keep up with demand. Normal burial customs were abandoned out of necessity. Bodies had to be disposed of quickly to prevent further spread of disease, and simply because there were so many. Gravediggers became essential workers. They were needed constantly and commanded high pay because the work was dangerous and unpleasant. Touching plague corpses exposed gravediggers to infection. Many gravediggers died themselves. New gravediggers had to be recruited continuously. The actual digging of graves was physically demanding. A grave must be deep enough that animals cannot dig up the body. For a single burial, a grave might be 2 meters deep, but digging thousands of individual graves was impossible during plague. Mass graves became necessary. Mass graves are large pits where multiple bodies are buried together. During plague, these pits might be 3 or 4 meters deep and large enough to hold hundreds of bodies. Bodies would be layered in the pit, sometimes with a layer of lime between layers to speed decomposition and reduce odor. Lime is calcium oxide, a white powdery substance that is alkaline and caustic. It was used in burials because it was believed to speed decomposition and reduce disease spread. Actually, lime slows decomposition by inhibiting bacteria. But the belief led to its widespread use in plague burials. The process of filling a mass grave was grim. Carts would arrive loaded with corpses. The bodies might be wrapped in shrouds, which are simple cloth wrappers, or they might be naked if cloth was scarce. The bodies would be tipped into the pit. Workers would arrange them to maximize space. When the pit was full, it would be covered with soil. Eventually, another pit would be dug nearby. Some burial grounds became filled with pits. Today, archaeologists excavating these sites find layers of skeletons packed tightly together, physical evidence of the catastrophe. Not all bodies made it to burial grounds. Some were thrown into rivers. In Avignon, as mentioned earlier, the Pope consecrated the Rhône River so bodies could be disposed of in it. This was spiritually necessary because unconsecrated disposal was believed to endanger souls. It was also practical because burial grounds were overwhelmed. Throwing bodies into rivers caused downstream contamination. Communities downstream would find corpses floating in their water supply. This would spread disease and horror, but in the extremity of plague, normal considerations of public health and decency could not always be observed. Some bodies were simply left where they fell. In houses where entire families died, bodies might lie undiscovered for days or weeks until the smell alerted neighbours. By then, decomposition was advanced. Removal was unpleasant and dangerous. Sometimes houses containing corpses were simply sealed and abandoned. In the countryside, bodies might be left in fields or beside roads. There was no one to bury them. Travellers would encounter corpses and give them wide berth, fearing contagion. Animals would scavenge the bodies. This was a breakdown of civilization, a reversion to barbarism forced by catastrophe. The psychological effect of these burial practices on survivors was severe. Watching your loved ones buried without ceremony in mass graves, or worse, thrown into rivers or left to rot, was traumatic. It violated deeply held beliefs about respect for the dead. It created a sense that society itself was collapsing. Let us examine the economic details of plague recovery in more tedious detail. After the initial pandemic subsided in 1351, Europe faced enormous challenges. The population had been reduced by a third to half. This meant fewer workers, fewer consumers, fewer taxpayers, fewer soldiers. Society had to reorganize around a smaller population. Agricultural land that had been cultivated was abandoned. With fewer people, less land needed to be farmed to produce sufficient food. Marginal land, land that was difficult to farm or not very productive, was abandoned first. This land reverted to wilderness. The abandonment of marginal land actually improved agricultural productivity per worker. The remaining land that was farmed was the best land, most productive and easiest to work. Farmers could be more selective. This contributed to improved living standards for survivors. Wages for labourers increased dramatically. Before plague, a day labourer might earn 2 pence per day. After plague, wages might triple or quadruple. Employers complained bitterly, but had to pay more because labour was scarce. Workers could demand better pay and conditions. This wage increase improved living standards for surviving workers. They could afford better food, better clothing, better housing. They had more bargaining power in negotiations with employers and landlords. This represented a significant shift in economic power toward the lower classes. Landlords and nobles saw their incomes decline. They owned land but needed workers to make it productive. With fewer workers available and those workers demanding higher pay, landlords' profits shrank. Some nobles became impoverished. Land lost value because it could not be worked profitably. Prices for goods fluctuated wildly. Initially, as production collapsed, prices for many goods rose. But with fewer consumers, demand also fell. The net effect varied by product and location. Some prices rose, some fell, some remained stable. Markets were chaotic for years. The price of food, especially grain, was particularly volatile. Harvests immediately after plague were poor because fields were not adequately planted or tended. This created shortages and high prices, but in subsequent years, as agriculture adapted to smaller population, grain prices fell. Manufactured goods became more expensive because craftsmen were scarce. If a village had one blacksmith and he died of plague, the village might have no blacksmith. Goods that required skilled labour, tools, cloth, horseshoes, became expensive. This created opportunities for surviving craftsmen to prosper. Trade recovered gradually. Initially, trade collapsed as merchants died and cities closed. But trade was essential for economy, and economic incentives drove its revival. New merchants entered the business. Trade routes reopened. Within a decade or two, trade volumes approached pre-plague levels. However, the composition of trade changed. With higher wages and better living standards, common people could afford some luxury goods. Demand increased for items like better cloth, spices, and manufactured goods. This changed what merchants traded and where they sought goods. The church's economic position was weakened. The church owned vast lands but faced the same labour shortages as secular landlords. Church income from rents and tithes declined. The church had to sell some land to raise money. This reduced the church's wealth and power relative to secular authorities. Urban areas grew relative to rural areas. Cities offered better economic opportunities after plague. Higher wages attracted rural workers to cities. Some abandoned agricultural land was converted to pasture, which required fewer workers. This accelerated urbanization that had begun before plague. New economic opportunities emerged. The chaos and social disruption created niches for entrepreneurs. People who were willing to take risks could profit. Social mobility increased. Some people from modest backgrounds became wealthy through trade or manufacturing. The feudal system continued weakening. Serfs who had been legally bound to land could negotiate freedom or simply leave. Lords lacked enforcement capacity because they needed workers. Free labour became more common than serfdom. This transition took generations, but plague accelerated it. Taxation became more difficult for governments. With smaller populations, there were fewer people to tax. Existing tax rates yielded less revenue. Governments tried to increase tax rates, which created resistance. Peasant revolts occurred in several countries, partly motivated by taxation disputes. The Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381 was partly a response to taxes and attempts to enforce pre-plague labour laws. Thousands of peasants marched on London demanding better treatment. The revolt was suppressed, violently, but it showed that common people were willing to challenge authority in ways they had not before plague. Similar revolts occurred in France, called the Jacquerie of 1358, and in other locations. These revolts were not directly caused by plague, but the social changes plague catalyzed contributed to the unrest. The old social order was breaking down. Let us examine the long-term cultural and intellectual consequences of plague in more boring detail. The plague experience shaped European culture for generations. The omnipresence of death influenced art, literature, philosophy, and religion in profound ways. The memento mori tradition flourished. Memento mori means remember that you will die. Art and literature incorporating death imagery became common. Skulls, skeletons, and scenes of decay appeared in paintings, sculptures, and decorative arts. These reminded viewers of mortality. The danse macabre, mentioned earlier, depicted death-leading representatives of all socials, classes in a dance. The message was that death comes for everyone, king and peasant, bishop and beggar, rich and poor. Social status provides no protection from mortality. This was a levelling message in hierarchical society. Tomb effigies changed. Before plague, effigies typically showed the deceased in idealized form, appearing alive and peaceful. After plague, transy tombs became popular. These showed the deceased as a decaying corpse, sometimes with worms and toads. This macabre realism reflected plague-era obsession with death. Literature became darker. Themes of mortality, suffering, and divine judgment pervaded texts. The dance of death appeared in literature as well as art. Mystery and morality plays performed for public audiences featured death prominently. These reflected and reinforced cultural preoccupation with mortality. Religious attitudes shifted in complex ways. Some people became more devout, seeing plague as divine punishment requiring repentance. Others lost faith, unable to reconcile a loving God with such suffering. Religious skepticism increased, though it was dangerous to express openly. The Church's authority was questioned. The Church had not predicted plague, had not prevented it, had not stopped it through prayer and intervention. Clergy had died at the same rates as lay people despite supposed spiritual protection. These facts raised doubts about church teachings. The shortage of educated clergy meant less qualified priests filled positions. This may have reduced the quality of religious instruction and pastoral care. It may have contributed to dissatisfaction with the Church that eventually contributed to Protestant Reformation. Mystical movements attracted followers. Mystics claimed direct experience of God without church mediation. This appealed to people seeking spiritual meaning outside official church structures. Mystics like Julian of Norwich and Meister Eckhart gained followings. Apocalyptic thinking increased. Some people interpreted plague as a sign of the end times described in the biblical book of Revelation. They believed the world would end soon. This apocalyptic expectation influenced behavior and cultural products. Universities were affected. Many scholars and students died. Some universities temporarily closed. However, universities eventually recovered and new universities were founded. The intellectual tradition continued despite disruptions. Medical education was questioned. If learned physicians could not cure or prevent plague, what good was their education? This led to some questioning of medical authority and traditional medical texts. Slowly, very slowly, this contributed to eventual medical progress. Philosophy was affected. Questions about divine justice, human suffering, and the meaning of life became urgent. Philosophers grappled with these questions. The experience of plague influenced philosophical thought about ethics, theology, and human nature. The Renaissance is sometimes linked to plague recovery. As Europe recovered economically, wealth allowed patronage of arts and learning. The demographic catastrophe disrupted old social structures, creating opportunities for change. New ideas could spread more easily. The Renaissance was not caused by plague, but plague may have contributed to conditions that allowed it. Scientific thinking eventually benefited from questioning of traditional authorities. If ancient texts were wrong about plague cure, maybe they were wrong about other things. This skepticism, taken to its logical conclusion over centuries, contributed to scientific revolution. However, these long-term intellectual and cultural consequences took many generations to fully manifest. The immediate effect of plague was trauma, grief, and social disruption. The positive consequences, if they can be called positive, emerged slowly over decades and centuries. For individual survivors, the experience was simply painful. They had lost family, friends, and community members. They had witnessed horrible suffering. They had to rebuild their lives in a devastated world. The intellectual and cultural consequences were abstractions. The lived reality was loss. Yet humans are resilient. People married and had children. Communities rebuilt. Trade resumed. Art was created. Knowledge was pursued. Life continued. The species survived catastrophe as it had survived previous catastrophes and would survive future ones. The Black Plague serves as a case study in pandemic response and social resilience. It shows how disease can devastate populations lacking medical knowledge and public health infrastructure. It shows how fear and ignorance can lead to harmful responses like scapegoating. It shows the importance of accurate understanding of disease transmission. It also shows human capacity for endurance and recovery. Medieval Europeans faced a catastrophe that killed half the population. They lacked modern medicine, technology, or scientific understanding, yet they survived, adapted, and eventually thrived. This demonstrates remarkable resilience. Modern humanity faces different challenges. Infectious disease remains a threat, as recent pandemics show. Climate change poses catastrophic risks. Nuclear weapons could devastate civilization. Biotechnology and artificial intelligence present both opportunities and dangers. We have advantages medieval people lacked: science, technology, global cooperation. But we also face uniquely modern threats. The lesson from plague is that catastrophes can occur and can devastate societies. Preparation, knowledge, and rational response matter. Cooperation matters. Maintaining social cohesion matters. Humans can survive extraordinary challenges if they adapt and work together. If you have continued reading to this point, this extraordinarily long and deliberately boring account has either put you to sleep, or you have inhuman tolerance for tedious historical detail. The Black Plague killed millions in the 14th century. It was caused by bacteria transmitted by fleas from rats. Medieval people did not understand this and could not prevent or cure it. Many died, some survived. Society adapted, life continued. The boring details of plague biology, transmission, symptoms, social responses, economic consequences, and cultural impacts have been exhaustively examined. Every tedious fact has been stated and restated. The repetition is intentional to induce sleep. Rest now, grateful for modern medicine and public health that protect you from such devastation. Good night, and may you dream of health and recovery, not disease and death. The account is complete. Sleep peacefully. One final aspect requires examination. The specific prevention measures that would have worked if only medieval people had possessed modern knowledge. This bears repeating in even more tedious detail to ensure complete understanding and maximum drowsiness. The single most effective measure would have been eliminating rat populations from human habitations. Rats were the reservoir for plague bacteria. Without rats living near humans, the disease could not have spread so effectively. Comprehensive rat control would have prevented most human plague cases. Rat control measures include eliminating food sources, eliminating shelter, and using traps or poison. Food should be stored in sealed metal or ceramic containers that rats cannot gnaw through. Grain stores should be elevated and protected. Garbage should be disposed of properly, not left where rats can access it. Shelters for rats include gaps in building construction, piles of debris, and cluttered spaces. Buildings should be constructed tightly with no gaps for rodents. Stone or brick construction is preferable to wood. Regular cleaning to remove clutter eliminates hiding places. These measures make environments less hospitable to rats. Traps can reduce rat populations. Snap traps kill rats quickly. Live traps capture them for disposal. However, trapping is labour-intensive and most effective when rat populations are already low. For heavy infestations, trapping alone is insufficient. Poison can kill large numbers of rats. However, medieval people did not have effective rat poisons. Modern rodenticides are specifically formulated to kill rodents. Some are anticoagulants that cause internal bleeding. Others damage kidneys or nervous systems. These would have been very effective during plague if they had existed. Cats are natural rat predators. Keeping cats could reduce rat populations. Medieval people did keep cats, but perhaps not in sufficient numbers or with sufficient encouragement. A systematic program of maintaining cat populations in cities might have helped reduce rats, and thus plague. The second most important measure would have been flea control. Even with rats present, preventing flea bites would prevent infection. Flea control measures include personal hygiene, cleaning living spaces, and using insect repellents. Personal hygiene means bathing regularly and washing clothes frequently. Bathing with soap removes fleas and their eggs from skin. Washing clothes in hot water kills fleas and their eggs. Changing to clean clothes regularly prevents flea accumulation. Medieval avoidance of bathing was counterproductive. Cleaning living spaces means sweeping floors, washing bedding, and removing organic debris. Fleas lay eggs that fall off the host and develop in the environment. Regular cleaning disrupts this life cycle. Fleas need organic matter for their larvae to feed on. Removing this matter reduces flea populations. Bedding should be washed frequently in hot water. Bed frames should be cleaned. Straw mattresses should be replaced regularly. These measures reduce flea populations in beds where people spend many hours and are vulnerable to bites. Insect repellents can prevent flea bites. Modern repellents containing DEET or picaridin are very effective. Medieval people did not have these chemicals. However, some plant-based repellents have modest effectiveness. Lavender, pennyroyal, and other herbs repel fleas somewhat. Widespread use might have helped slightly. Wearing tight woven clothing that covers the body reduces skin exposed to flea bites. Long sleeves and pants, high collars, and boots provide barriers. However, if clothing is infested with fleas, as it often was in medieval times, this protection is limited. Clean clothing is essential. The third important measure would have been isolation of plague cases. People with bubonic or septicemic plague should be isolated to prevent fleas from moving from them to healthy people. People with pneumonic plague should be isolated to prevent airborne transmission. Isolation means keeping sick people physically separated from healthy people, ideally in a separate room or building with no contact. Food and water can be left outside. Caregivers should minimize contact and take protective measures. Protective measures for caregivers include wearing coverings to prevent flea bites and respiratory protection to prevent inhaling bacteria from pneumonic patients. Gloves protect hands. Long garments protect bodies. Face coverings reduce inhalation of infectious droplets. After a plague patient dies, the body should be handled carefully. Corpses can harbour fleas. People handling bodies should wear protective clothing. Bodies should be buried or cremated promptly. Bedding and clothing should be burned or washed in very hot water to kill fleas. Quarantine of travellers and goods from plague areas would help prevent introduction to new areas. Ships arriving from affected areas should be held for observation. Passengers and crew should be monitored for symptoms. Cargo should be inspected for rats. These measures are difficult but can help prevent spread. Public health communication would allow people to make informed decisions. Authorities should provide accurate information about plague, transmission, symptoms, and protective measures. This allows individuals to take appropriate actions. Misinformation and superstition should be corrected. Community organisation is necessary for effective response. Coordinated efforts to control rats and fleas, isolate cases, dispose of bodies, and maintain food supply require planning and cooperation. Leadership matters. Communities with good organisation would fare better than disorganised ones. All of these measures were either unknown or inadequately implemented in medieval Europe. The result was catastrophic mortality. With modern knowledge applied systematically, plague mortality could have been reduced enormously, perhaps by 90% or more. This demonstrates the value of scientific knowledge and public health systems, and with this final, exhaustive examination of prevention measures, we finally reach the true conclusion of this monumentally long and deliberately soporific account of the Black Plague. Every conceivable aspect has been explored in tedious detail. The story is complete. Sleep well, protected by modern science. Good night.